Hello. Welcome to day 2 of 5 days of Facebook Lives. I will give this a few seconds for people to come on. So today I am doing this on my Courageous Journeys Facebook page. I will also be uploading this to YouTube. So if you are joining me live, I would love to know who is here, who's joining me. And if you're watching this on replay, please let me know that, #replay. If you've got any questions, you can feel free to leave them in the comments. And if you're watching this on YouTube afterwards, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your thoughts and any questions that you might have about today's topic. So, hello, Pam. Welcome. So let me know that you're here. It doesn't seem to be letting me know who's coming on. Hi, Lindsay. So I'd love to know who I'm talking to live, who I'm sharing this beautiful day with. Here in Arizona, it's hot, but it is a beautiful day. So today, I want to talk about boundaries. And boundaries are something that there's no way that I'm going to be able to talk about everything related to boundaries in this live video. But there's a lot we can talk about. And so I will take questions and respond to comments and stuff at the end. But I want to be able to, get into boundaries. So I'm going to talk about a few different aspects as kind of more of an overview and to help kind of understand yourself and even people around you maybe a little bit better. So we hear a lot about boundaries, in part because it's an important part of our existence in the world. But most of us, unless you've been working with a coach or a therapist or something like that, most of us don't really have a great sense of either what boundaries are, and certainly not what our own boundaries are, because everybody's boundaries are different. We might share the same boundaries with other people. We may have the same idea about what we like and what we don't like, but they're very individual. And so a boundary is ultimately a limit that you set for your space, for the people around you. So it's a physical boundary, it's an emotional boundary. It may be different for different people. Boundaries are not necessarily meant to be completely rigid. When you have a very rigid boundary, that's usually coming from a relatively unhealthy place. It's often because you're in self-protective mode. And that could look a lot of different ways, but it's often about that. So having very rigid boundaries, we don't want that. We also don't want a complete lack of boundaries because that just doesn't feel good, really, for anybody. If you think about raising children, people will often say children want boundaries. So they want to have a time that they're supposed to be home. They want to have some idea of routine. They need to know what to expect. Those are all aspects of boundaries, and children do well with that because it sets limits. And we all need to know what those limits are. We need to know them for ourselves, and other people need to know what their limits are so that we don't intrude, don't overstep those limits. So again, a boundary is really just a limit that we have for the people around us emotionally and physically. So we develop our sense of boundaries or lack thereof generally as children. And I think this is kind of changing a little bit now, but for the most part, for anybody watching this video, I'm guessing you were not taught specifically about boundaries as a child. good chance that the conversation, like you never even heard the word boundary unless it was kind of unrelated in some aspect as a child. But we experience them anyway. We observe the people around us and their boundaries. If you have a parent or a sibling or an aunt or somebody in your life who doesn't necessarily have very good boundaries and the people around that person take advantage of them, you absorb that to some extent. If somebody has really rigid boundaries and never lets anybody close physically or emotionally, never shares anything of consequence, that's a rigid boundary. And while it may never be spoken specifically, you pick up on that. So typically what we learn about boundaries is by what we observe and what we experience by those people. And when somebody has a very rigid boundary, a parent, a caretaker has a very rigid boundary, we often tend to, that creates issues around our own boundaries for sure, but it can also create issues around self-worth and acceptance. If a parent has really no boundaries whatsoever, not only does it teach us potentially that that's how you're supposed to be, but it also leaves you kind of like you're flailing out there without having a sense of kind of rules or expectations, a good understanding of what healthy is. And then, of course, we take what we learn as children into our adult lives. So this is true for everybody. So if you see people that are taken advantage of a lot, just they're always doing things for people, and then maybe they even complain about it afterwards, that leaves you with a sense that it's kind of not okay to have a boundary, and that you can't really trust people because they treat you badly. When you have an abuse history, particularly sexual abuse, it just naturally teaches you very directly, even if not overtly, but it teaches you that what you want doesn't matter. It teaches you that your body is not your own. It teaches you that how you feel doesn't matter. So people that have childhood abuse histories really struggle with boundaries. It doesn't necessarily mean that they won't have any, though that is more often the case. They could also have incredibly rigid boundaries as a way to self-protect. So we develop these in childhood, and then they progress typically as we get older. And one of the difficult things about it is that we often don't even recognize that we have these boundaries. We just think it's part of who we are. It's just part of how the world works. It's just how relationships work. We have all these ideas about what it means that we're left not feeling good in interactions with people, even with strangers. So having an awareness that you don't even really recognize what your own boundaries are, while it can feel unsettling, it's actually good to be able to recognize that, because as I said, many of us, if not most of us, at least if we haven't done a lot of healing work, really have no idea what our boundaries are. So being aware that you're not aware of what your boundaries are, that you don't know what feels okay to you, is a good step. Once you begin to recognize that you are incredibly rigid in your boundaries or very loose in your boundaries, then you can start to notice what feels good about that and what doesn't feel good about that. Because ultimately, how we determine what our own personal boundaries are is in large part by identifying what feels good and what doesn't. Now, there's a difference in many ways between what might feel good and what might feel safe. Now, as you're healing, hopefully those things kind of go together. But the reality is, for most of us, before we've really done a lot of healing, we tend to think that safe is what feels good. But for most of us, what feels safe perpetuates the struggle that we have. It feels safe because it's what we're used to. It feels safe because we think that that's what's expected of us. And if we behave in a way that's expected, then we're less likely to be hurt. So being able to recognize that just because something feels safe or comfortable even doesn't mean it's what we actually truly want in our heart. So when you interact with people, does the proximity, physical proximity, does it affect you? Do you feel uncomfortable if people get too close? And is that discomfort because you don't feel safe? Or is it because you just don't like people crowding you? And my guess is, and this is a reasonable thing, but for some people it doesn't necessarily matter a whole lot, but typically we might feel a lot more comfortable and even good if it's somebody that we know and trust who is close to us in our physical space. Like somebody looking over our shoulder or something like that, if we know and trust them, probably isn't going to bother us a whole lot. But if it's somebody we don't know, then it feels really uncomfortable, and it might even make you feel kind of agitated. So, and no matter whether you're aware of your boundaries or not, you are likely aware of that. Like a stranger getting too close to you, that's kind of a big one, or somebody touching you, even if it's not meant in any sort of negative context, but just having somebody touch you, like put their hand on your shoulder. And this is true for people that haven't been abused as well. Does it feel uncomfortable or does it feel okay? Because we tend to, when something feels uncomfortable in terms of a boundary, and I will say, generally speaking, this is a general statement, that women tend to have a harder time with this than men do because we are socialized as children differently. Females are typically socialized differently than males are. Girls are supposed to be nice and all of that. And certainly our bodies are objectified, which means that we don't have a right to our own body. But really noticing just how does that feel to you? If something feels uncomfortable, we will often dismiss it. We'll talk ourselves out of it. Oh, I'm just overreacting. Oh, they didn't really mean anything. Just different things like that. We'll just really try to rationalize that we shouldn't be feeling the way that we are. Now, I also want to make it clear that when you're working on healing and you're working on identifying what your boundaries are, sometimes it can be helpful to recognize that understanding your boundaries and working on feeling safe in particular kinds of situations is actually a healthy thing, while also keeping in mind that it doesn't mean that we need to let everybody kind of into that personal space, because that is not necessarily a healthy thing at all. One of the things that for me that I really noticed as I even just got older, I think, but certainly I was also in the healing process, is like standing in line somewhere, like at a grocery store or a bank or whatever, and having people stand behind me, like this close behind me. For a long time, I knew it didn't feel comfortable, but I wouldn't do anything. I was afraid that if I moved forward even, that I might upset the person behind me, like they would think I was being rude or something. I know there's probably a lot of you that can relate to that idea, even if not the same exact example. But I knew that it didn't feel comfortable, but I talked myself out of it. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I told myself that I would hurt the person's feelings behind me, or that they'd get mad at me, or they'd think I was being ridiculous, that I was overreacting. We tell ourselves all different kinds of things to dismiss how we feel. We do this as children, right? Even aside from abuse, as a child, you might, even in a school setting, like if you're coming into a classroom or something and everybody's sitting on the floor in first grade and there's a lot of kids, you might be told, squeeze in together because there's not that much room. Well, it might not feel comfortable to you, but you're told you have to do that. So even though there's nothing specifically wrong with that, you're taught that what you feel doesn't matter. That what is comfortable to you doesn't matter. That this is what you have to do. So we learn over time and experience to not honor what we desire or what feels okay, which leads to not trusting what we desire and feels okay. And again, being told that you have to squeeze in together, there's nothing wrong with that inherently. By itself, there's really nothing wrong with that. Being told to give your grandmother a hug, inherently, there's nothing really wrong with that. But again, it teaches you that you have to do things that may not feel comfortable to you. And I think now people are talking about it a little bit more, and people are telling their children, don't make your kid give that person a hug or a kiss. Don't make that person sit on that person's lap or whatever, which is not a bad thing. I think that there's a lot of good that can come from that. But I think it's also important to recognize that our boundaries are violated as children by completely innocent experiences. But what it leaves you with is not valuing your own desires. So we recognize what our boundaries are by noticing what feels good and what doesn't feel good. And this is hard for a lot of people, because when you recognize that something that you're doing, especially for somebody that you care about or around somebody that you care about, doesn't feel good to you, you'll often end up feeling guilty, maybe even ashamed, thinking that you shouldn't feel that way. And when you go to that place, then you're discounting what feels okay to you and telling yourself that you should do it anyway, that it should feel okay. So when we can pay attention at first, and I think it's important to be able to practice this for a while, is just noticing when you're in different circumstances with different people, what feels okay and what doesn't feel okay, what feels comfortable and what doesn't feel comfortable. So that's more kind of physical, and it's also emotional, but it's definitely a physical thing. Emotional boundaries are similar, but also a little bit different. And certainly emotional boundaries can look very different depending on the nature of the relationship. And emotional boundaries are often also something that people who have been abused as children really struggle with. But I think it is important to recognize that while they can go together, the physical boundaries and emotional boundaries are a little bit different. So emotional boundaries are what we feel, again, that we're okay with, but what are we willing to kind of tolerate? What feels okay and doesn't feel okay in terms of the people around us, how they show up, how they treat us, how they respect our time, our effort, our energy, whether they don't respect that. We may have an idea of this feels good to me to do, but with some people, if they don't respect that, if they don't value that, if they don't honor you as an individual, then your boundary with that person may be very different. And recognizing and setting boundaries is a lot of trial and error because it is different based on the relationship that you have with people. Your boundaries might even fluctuate a little bit depending on how you're feeling. If you're feeling vulnerable for whatever reason, then a looser boundary that you have with somebody, you may feel like it needs to be a little bit stronger because you're feeling vulnerable. And that's okay. That really is okay. And depending on the nature of the relationship, if you have somebody that's close to you and they're used to you being a certain way in terms of boundaries or how you show up or being okay with how they show up, it can be an important and helpful conversation to have. But recognizing that what feels okay to you at one time may not feel okay to you at another time. And also recognizing that we cannot expect that other people will know that. Other people can't read our mind and know that today is a day that I can be a little bit closer physically versus not. So as we're figuring out what our boundaries are, it is important to recognize that if we want people to abide by the boundaries that we are identifying and setting, we have to express what those boundaries are to people. And sometimes we can do that very directly and say, I'm okay with this, I'm not okay with that, please don't do that. You're okay, it's okay for you to do this. But often people understand what our boundaries are because of how we respond to different things or not respond. And that's okay too. Now, depending on, like if it's somebody that you're really close to, especially if you're working on identifying what your boundaries are and that may change, I think it is helpful to be able to express what that boundary is. And you don't have to say, this is a boundary, this is my boundary. You can just say, please don't do that. That's a really easy way to set a boundary. A really easy way. Doesn't mean that it's easy to do, because that's a whole other thing. But it is a way to make clear what your boundary is. Now, if this is a new boundary in that relationship or that dynamic, that person is going to need some reminders. And if that person is not healthy, they may choose to not abide by that boundary. But when we do set a new boundary with somebody, it takes some time for us to feel settled in that and confident. And it also will take some time for that person to adjust to the new boundary. Kind of like, again, thinking about raising children. If a child is used to doing something, or even a dog, if a child is used to doing something and suddenly there's this new rule, it's going to take a little time for them to get used to that. It's going to take you being consistent with that rule for them to understand that this is the new way of being. And if you think about it like a dog, the same thing. If you're training them and they're used to being able to do something, and then suddenly you begin to change what they're able to do, it's going to take some time, right, for them to really understand that this is what the boundary is. And if you're not clear on what that boundary is, so sometimes they get to do it, sometimes they don't, well, they're never going to learn to abide by that boundary because it's not an absolute. And that's difficult for that person, but it's even more difficult for us in many ways, because when we feel like we know what a boundary is, but we have difficulty maintaining that boundary, expressing it, then maintaining it, we doubt ourselves. And when we doubt ourselves, we tend to kind of give in to a lot of our boundaries. And this is kind of the really challenging piece of setting boundaries with lots of different types of circumstances and situations and relationships, because we struggle with setting the boundary because we might feel bad about it. But we also struggle with setting a boundary or even identifying a boundary because we often don't feel like we have a right for that boundary. We believe, without it even being conscious necessarily, we believe that other people's desires, what they want, somehow matters more than what we want. That if we set this boundary, that we're going to hurt them, that we're going to make them angry, that they won't like us. And this is something that I see all the time, something that I have certainly struggled with as well. The people that are close to us, even if it's an unhealthy situation, we struggle the most with setting boundaries with people who are close to us. And generally speaking, particularly with our family that we grew up in, and those relationships that were close as we grew up. Because again, those are the relationships that taught us that we don't really have any boundaries. So it's hard. And if there is any wounding with any of those relationships, and it doesn't have to be abuse specifically, it could be lots of different types of wounding. But if there's any wounding tied to that, then it's a really complex relationship. And setting a boundary with that is incredibly challenging. This is one of the things that inevitably comes up in almost everybody that I've ever worked with. And typically it is a partner, a family of origin, so the family that you grew up in, and even children oftentimes, because we end up experiencing so much guilt. And for many of us, while guilt and shame are not necessarily the same thing at all, when we have shame, guilt typically immediately triggers shame. So whenever we think about setting a boundary or trying to enforce a boundary, it triggers shame. And so we decide to let it go. And there are all kinds of things that we might say to ourselves about that to let that boundary go. But that's what we do. If, for example, one of the things that often comes up is moms, and I think that this is true even for people that don't have abuse histories, but maybe you have a mother or a kind of a caregiver role person, person that provided that role in your life, who is a little enmeshed, maybe they're in your business too much, or maybe they are not particularly supportive, like always pointing out the things that you're doing wrong. You can love them. Maybe you don't know how you feel about them, but you could actually love them. You may even be able to see that, objectively on the whole, that maybe they're actually a good person, but you know that the relationship brings up all kinds of stuff for you, that you end up leaving a conversation with that person not feeling very good. Maybe you're just really anxious or stressed out, or maybe you're not feeling good about yourself. But then when you think about setting a boundary, so maybe you're not going to talk to that person as much. Maybe you're not going to answer the phone when they call. You then will feel badly, think you're overreacting, think that you're being mean. What are people going to think about me? What if she dies? There's so many different ways that we talk ourselves out of what feels right for us. So we have the desire to set this boundary, but then we talk ourselves out of it. And then not only do we feel badly because of the interaction, but then we feel badly, weak, ashamed, frustrated, hopeless, because we feel like we failed in setting that boundary or maintaining that boundary. So while on the kind of surface, if you just look at it in terms of black and white on paper, boundaries themselves are not necessarily that complicated because it's what feels okay and what doesn't. But when it comes to identifying our boundaries, and especially implementing and maintaining those boundaries, it's incredibly challenging. And the more complex the relationship with that person, the more difficult it is. It's one of the things that I think probably presents ongoing challenge, equally, if not more so than almost anything else in this whole process as time goes on. Because there are so many pieces that can kind of trigger, in a sense, our desire to be loving while also taking care of ourselves. Our fear of being abandoned even can be a big reason that we fear setting and maintaining a boundary. And when it comes to family members, especially parents, part of what creates such a challenge for it is that, and I've talked about this in different ways, but we often hold on to hope that at some point, maybe it will be different. That maybe the next time you have that phone call or the next time you see her, she'll be a little nicer. She'll tell you that she loves you. She'll put her arms around you and you'll feel the love that you feel that you've never gotten before. And so when we think about setting a boundary, and whether it's not having any contact or limiting the contact, part of what's happening subconsciously quite often is that it creates this really intense fear at times that we may be cutting off the only hope that it will ever be different. So as we work on identifying and implementing these boundaries, it's really important to have somebody that you can kind of just talk about what's going on. And I think that, you know, if you're in a healing process, then I think having a therapist that you can talk to about that is really helpful and a great place to be able to do that. But I also think that having friends who get it, or a partner who gets it, or something that kind of understands why it's important to set this boundary, that they can be a good resource too, to just kind of cheer you on as you're struggling with setting that boundary. I think it's also important to recognize that as we grow, as we heal, as our lives change, that a boundary that feels helpful, necessary, good at one point may feel different down the road. And that can be helpful when you're in this stage of identifying that this relationship doesn't feel good to me and I need to set some boundaries. One of the fears that often comes up is that if I set this boundary, then I'm ending this relationship. And while that can be true because you have no control over how that person will respond to you, quite often that doesn't have to be the case. That even if you're setting some limits and not communicating with that person because there's just no way to have healthy communication or experience with that person, which is the case for a lot of relationships, you may choose, when you're feeling a little bit stronger in the belief in yourself and what you desire, you may choose that you might want to try it again because you feel like you can maintain boundaries. And you can choose to do that at that time. You know, one of the things that I talk about often is that people struggle with is having any sort of relationship with an abuser. I am not somebody who will tell somebody that they cannot have a relationship with their abuser. That's not for me to decide. Do I think generally it's going to help in your healing? Probably not. But as you're healing, or when you feel like you've done a lot of healing, and especially if the abuser is somebody kind of in your family or something like that, you may decide that you're in a place where seeing that person, that you can manage that you can set some strong boundaries. Maybe you don't have conversations with them. Maybe you don't be alone with them in the same space. Maybe you don't even have conversations with them. But you can choose to do that when you're in a place when you've been able to practice that. So the same thing is true for just people that aren't particularly healthy. And I also want to say, I'm not advocating that you have a relationship with your abuser, because abusers typically don't change, and generally speaking, they're not healthy. And so probably just not a good person to have a lot of interaction with, generally speaking. But what you decide is right for you now, you can decide later that something else might work better for you, or that you'd like to see if something else could work for you. And one kind of big example of this that I see quite often is that as people are healing and maybe they have a new partner or maybe they have children and decide, particularly if it wasn't an abusive parent, but might decide to try to re-engage with a family member, to just have more family around and allow your children or your partner to get to know your family or something like that. So you might decide then to identify what are the boundaries and parameters going to be for this relationship. And having this, it is in part strength, but it's also a willingness to kind of take risks and stand up for yourself, but to set those boundaries and maintain them. And if that person isn't willing to honor those boundaries, being able to kind of walk away from that, which is not an easy thing to do, which is part of the reason that I think working with a therapist through this can be really helpful, because a therapist is an objective person who doesn't have their own agenda in whether you have a relationship with this person or not. Their agenda is for you to be the healthiest person that you can be, the happiest, healthiest person that you can be. And so they can help you kind of navigate that. They can help you work through any guilt that might come up, or frustration, or whatever it might be. And so recognizing that boundaries may change over time can be helpful when, if particularly early on in the healing, if you're recognizing that this relationship just isn't healthy for me and I need to either completely cut it off or significantly limit the interaction, recognizing that you may choose to do something differently down the road can help ease some of the fear and the guilt that you might be experiencing in even just the thought of setting some limits with that relationship. So I made some notes, so I'm wanting to make sure that I'm covering everything. I think I got all things that I wrote down as notes. So boundaries are something that takes a lot of practice. It takes practice in recognizing what feels okay and what doesn't for us. And it takes a lot of practice to be able to set and maintain them, because people that have been in your life, even a coworker, when you begin to set boundaries, the people around you who are used to you not having any boundaries are going to push back. And depending on what their boundaries are or how they tend to show up in the world, they may push back really hard. You might even be able to relate to this. One of the things that happens quite often as people are healing is that you do kind of just naturally begin to set boundaries. Maybe you begin to have conversations that are a little uncomfortable. Maybe you avoid people or something like that. And people around you will say things like, "You've changed. Who do you think you are? Ever since you started seeing that therapist, you've just become a different person." Partners will often have a really, really difficult time with this. If they're used to you being a certain way and you start asking for what you need, or not doing things that you don't want to do, taking time for yourself, people will push back against that. And it's not even a conscious thing. Sometimes it is, but quite often it's not a conscious thing. They're not necessarily sitting around thinking, "Oh my God, I can't believe she's setting these boundaries. Who does she think she is?" They might, on a conscious level, desire for you to feel better. But when they're used to you kind of always deferring to them about what you're going to have for dinner, or deferring to them about how you're going to spend your weekend, or always being there when they need you, when you start setting some limits around that and they're not getting what they're used to, they're likely going to push back. And when people are unhealthy, that pushback often looks and feels hurtful. And that's nothing to do with you. Certainly doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong. But they're not comfortable with that. Just like children, when you begin to set a boundary or a curfew or whatever, they push the limits. They might get mad at you. "I hate you. You're so mean." Right? That's what they do. The dog we're fostering, she has got a personality. She was on the streets for some time. She's used to doing whatever the heck she wants. And I am trying to get her to not bite on me. She doesn't bite hard, but like to bite on people, to jump on people. And when I tell her no, and I'm firm with that, she'll stop. But then she barks at me because she's not happy about it. And it's the same thing. She's trying to get me to let her do what she wants to do. Children do the same thing, and the adults in our lives will do the same things. And if they're not healthy, it often is hurtful. Like, really, one of the things that so often happens is you've changed since you started going to therapy, or you've changed since you started working on healing, or and of course it's said in a way that's like, "Who the hell do you think you are?" Or, "I don't like this new person that's emerging." And it's done because they want you to go back to the way that you've always been. And again, doesn't mean that it's conscious, and it doesn't mean that they are trying to sabotage your healing necessarily. It just means that it's making them uncomfortable. And that's what we naturally tend to do when something makes us uncomfortable. So it is important to have a conversation with them. And sometimes they can adjust, especially if it's pointed out to them. But the reality is there are some people in our lives, especially if you have a history of abuse, we tend to have people in our lives who do not treat us well much of the time, that those people will not respect our boundaries. They will be angry that we begin to set them. They'll be angry that we begin to take care of ourselves. And that's hard. It hurts. And that's another reason why I think having the support of a therapist or a mentor who has a lot of experience in this field is really important, because we need to have somebody who can hold space for us in working through all that comes up in that experience. So I know that there's so much more that I could have talked about. There are pieces within each of these aspects that I brought up that I could share a whole lot more. And I am planning to do that in a course on boundaries that will go into it much more deeply. You'll get some exercises that you can begin to practice, some videos and potentially some meditations. I'm not sure exactly what it's going to look like yet, but that will be coming soon. So I would love to have you join me for that as we work on all things related to boundaries. So I'm going to go through now. We are at 46 minutes. So if you've got any questions around boundaries, please feel free to share them here, and I will take some time and see if I can answer them. Hello, everybody. I like when people tell me their boundaries. I can't read into people's boundaries otherwise. That's an incredibly valid point. And I actually think that most of us cannot read other people's boundaries. We can make assumptions. We can kind of, if we're good at reading body language, we can kind of pick up on some things. But the reality is that we're still making assumptions. Because a lot of times people's body language, as I was talking about what feels good versus what feels safe, a lot of times their body language may say one thing, but what would really feel good to them might be something different. So we can't really understand what somebody else's boundary is unless we've made that clear in some way. And we can make that clear without saying this is a boundary. In fact, I don't think that's normal conversational things that people would do. But you can say, please don't do that. Or I don't like it when you do this. This makes me uncomfortable. I'd like it if you did this. Because setting boundaries isn't just about saying what we don't like. It's also letting people know what we do like, especially in a partnership. That's really important. I think with friendships as well. And I was talking about different aspects of boundaries. Boundaries are true in personal relationships, and they're true in professional relationships as well, with coworkers who maybe try to put all their work onto you, or don't keep coming into your space and interrupting you, or talking about other people in the office. A boss who doesn't respect or value your time, so your time boundary, your work hour boundary. So there's a lot of ways that boundaries can be violated that we don't necessarily identify as being violated. We often will think, especially as survivors of childhood dysfunction and abuse, we will often think that they have a right to request that or expect that of us, and that we don't have a right to feel badly about it. And that's where the healing piece comes in, because as we heal, we begin to recognize that isn't in fact true. So yeah, being able to make our boundaries known is important in all close relationships, I guess I would say, especially because people can't know. And when we don't have clear boundaries with people, then they assume that whatever they're doing or want to do is acceptable and okay. And again, that's not necessarily a conscious thing. They're not typically saying, what can I get away with? Some people actually are, but for the most part, people are not sitting back and contemplating, let's see what I can get away with today. It's just that they kind of continue to try to get more and more. And the reality is we all do that to some extent. Not saying that we all do that in an unhealthy way, but that is just the natural dynamic of relationships. So being aware of our own boundaries, letting people know what those boundaries are, is necessary for healthy relationships. It is absolutely necessary to be in a healthy and happy relationship to know what those boundaries are. One of the things that comes up too quite often in partnerships is that like physical boundaries around like physical intimacy and sex can be another kind of complicated boundary to identify for yourself, especially as a survivor of abuse. And that certainly can be a whole other topic by itself. But recognizing what your own boundaries are around your body and about your sexual desire or lack of desire, what feels okay to you, what doesn't feel okay, what feels good, what doesn't feel good. All of those are important pieces in a healthy relationship as well. And certainly a challenging aspect when you've had an abuse history. This is a really valid and important question, Allison. People often can't tell you what their boundary is. So that is a very real reality. But I think even if we are asking somebody, is it okay if I do this? And this can be a challenge, but like especially with children or a partner or a friend, like these would probably be the biggest examples, we can say, is it okay if I do this? Or do you mind if I do this? Or can I give you a hug or whatever? You can ask that question. And if you're asking the question, then you're giving them the choice. And as a healthy human being, that's kind of the best that we can do it for the most part. With children, it may be a little bit different, but generally speaking, especially for an older child, that would be the case. So if we ask somebody, is it okay? And they say yes, we have to be able to trust that that's truly how they feel. We can, if we've put that question out there, we cannot take responsibility for them feeling that we've crossed a boundary. They can't blame us for crossing a boundary if they've said yes or not said no, depending on what the circumstance is. And this is a really challenging thing because so many of us, especially abuse survivors, saying no is incredibly difficult. So when somebody asks something of us, even if we want to say no, even if everything inside of us is screaming no, what comes out of our mouth is a yes. Or we even shake our head, yes. Because we don't know how to say no. And it's important to recognize that if somebody's asking and we say yes when we don't want to, we can't hold that person responsible for doing that thing that we told them that they could do. And one kind of example that's coming to mind is like even a work situation, your boss asks you to stay late. Well, if they're asking, so assuming that they're asking in a professional, reasonable way, but you don't want to and you've got plans, but you say, okay, you can't really be mad at your boss for asking you to stay because they asked and you didn't trust yourself. You didn't honor your own desires and needs. And this is a huge challenge for people, and where, again, a lot of shame can kick in, and a reminder that what you want doesn't matter. And we think that our boss is telling us that what we want doesn't matter, when in fact, when given the choice, we are dishonoring what we want. And we're afraid to say no. And there are different reasons why we might be afraid to say no, but ultimately we're afraid to say no. So when we are going to somebody and asking something of them, we have to be able to trust that what they're saying is what's true for them. We have to. And depending on the nature of the relationship, we could actually even say that. We could say, I'm trying to think of an example that you might have with a friend or a partner or something like that. Like the example of sex. So if your partner, or if you're wanting to have sex and you go to your partner and say, hey, I want to have sex, and your partner says yes, then you have to be able to trust that what they say is what they mean. And you could let them know. You could actually say to them, and this applies to any type of circumstance, you could say to them, I hope that you mean that, or I'm going to trust that you mean that. Or if you're even asking somebody what their opinion is, being able to trust that what they're saying to you is really how they feel. And that's hard. And part of the reason we struggle with that is because we feel responsible for other people and how they feel. And that's part of healing in general too, is to let go of that. And that's kind of a boundary thing too. But we have to be able to trust that that person is honoring themselves. We cannot take responsibility for somebody not honoring that. And when we try to read into what they really want, no matter what they're saying, we often get it wrong. We often get it wrong, because part of what we're assuming is based on our own expectations, I guess, our own experiences, our own fears even. And that's a hard thing to do, to get to a place where you trust that. Early in my work, I would try to read between lines. Like actually try, not just kind of a natural, oh my God, I can't think of the word, intuition. Not just like a natural intuition, but I would actually feel like I had a responsibility to try to read between the lines. And whether I got it wrong or right almost didn't matter, because the level of responsibility that I took on was unreasonable and stressed me out. And also, I think, impacted how a client might have felt in that moment. And I started getting to a point where, I might ask a question, and if I felt that maybe the answer wasn't true for themselves, maybe consciously they weren't being honest, or often is the case, subconsciously they weren't being honest with themselves, I would often say, I'm going to trust that that is how you feel, or that that is what you desire, because I can't know for sure. I have to be able to give them the ability to discern for themselves what they do and they don't want, what is okay and what is not okay. But it's a challenge, and it takes a lot of practice. We have to be able to let go of the responsibility to be able to do that. And that's a lot healing that we have to do to be able to do that. But a great question. And I think we can also say, well, how would it feel? How would it feel if I did? How would it feel if I don't? Which one feels better? That's one way that we can kind of help children understand what their boundaries are. Or even a friend, for example, if they're coming to you with something, you could have a conversation with them like that. Hello. So are there any other questions about anything related to boundaries, even if I didn't necessarily cover it today? I feel like there are a lot of different things that I could continue to talk about here, but there's only so much time. So does anybody else have any questions or comments or thoughts? Or if you're watching this now, or if you're watching this on replay, and there are aspects of boundaries that you would like to see in a course, or something that you know that is a challenge for you, that you would like to see in a course, please feel free to share that in the comments. Because obviously, if I'm going to create a course, I want to create a course with the types of things that are of interest to you and things that are coming up for you to help you be able to work through. So please feel free to share those thoughts and suggestions, struggles that you have around boundaries. Feel free to share those in the comments as well for a possible group. So if there are no more questions or comments, then I will sign off for the day. But if you've got anything, feel free to share it. I will stay on for another minute or so. So one of the things that I challenged yesterday, it's hard to believe this is only Tuesday, with the gratitude challenge is, as I'm doing this challenge and showing up every day, is challenging you to identify a couple of things every day to feel good about in terms of gratitude. So I hope that you are doing that. I hope that you're thinking about it ideally in the morning and again at night, connecting with something that you feel good about for yourself or something that you've accomplished in the day. Just really connecting to what that feels like in your body. And I guarantee that you will look at things a little bit differently by the end of the week. So just a reminder, if you haven't been keeping up with that in the last couple of days, that it's not too late to get started. Oh, sorry, Jessie, I didn't see a question from you. Can people who push back use guilt trips? Absolutely. That's probably the number one thing that they will use to try to get you to let go of that boundary, let go of that limit, whatever it is. Guilt trip, like even all those examples that I gave of things that people might say or whatever, all of it ultimately is about guilt, trying to make you feel badly in some way about what you're doing, that it's not okay, that you should be like ashamed of yourself, that you've changed, which I always find kind of interesting, because if you just think about our lifespan, ideally you're not the same person at 25 that you were at 15. Ideally, you're a little different in terms of your worldview and your ability to feel more settled in yourself and therefore more confident in setting boundaries at 40 than you were at 25, or even 30 and 25. Because again, at 25, your brain is possibly still not completely developed. Everybody's a little bit different, but 23 to 25 is generally about the age that your brain is fully developed. And then, of course, you're going to feel a little bit different at 60 than you do at 40. We are not meant to stay the same. We're not. Age, experience changes us. And hopefully for the better as time goes on. As we get a little older, we just feel a little bit more settled in who we are. being a kid and being a young adult is challenging, no matter what your history is, especially at this time in our history. There is so much uncertainty, so much comparison, so much expectation about what things should look like. Depending on all kinds of things. So it's not even that there's one specific ideal. It's, well, if it's this, then it's this ideal. If it's this, then it's this ideal. But we're supposed to change. And when the people around you are staying the same, they will push back. And one of the things that often happens as we heal, as we grow, as we mature, is that often we do leave people behind. And that's not a judgment about them, but often that is around just being in different places, not having our boundaries respected. We recognize that what we were willing to tolerate or put up with at one point is not something that we are willing to put up with any longer. And that's healthy. We shouldn't be putting up with things in our lives, at least not from the people that are closest to us. I mean, there's obviously a lot of circumstances that we have absolutely no control over, but ideally, we should not be putting up with people that are close to us in our lives. But that's hard. It's hard to move past that, exactly for the reason that you brought up, Jessie, the guilt. And one of the things about being an abuse survivor, especially sexual abuse, is that we will feel guilty about virtually anything and everything. And because there is so much inherent shame in being a survivor of sexual abuse, anytime that we feel guilty, it triggers shame. I could say probably 100% of the time, no matter what it is that we might feel guilty about, it's going to trigger shame. And then what that looks like can look a lot of different ways, but it certainly doesn't leave us feeling very good. Certainly doesn't leave us feeling like we have a right to our boundaries, to ask for what we want or don't want. So thank you all for being here and joining me on this live today on boundaries. So I will look forward to seeing you tomorrow for the live, and I will be sharing where I'll be doing that and what time I will be doing that, probably a little bit later today or maybe tomorrow morning. So I will look forward to seeing you then. Thank you for joining me. If you're watching this on the replay, please let me know that you're watching it. And again, if you're watching this on YouTube or as a replay, feel free to share your questions, your thoughts in the comments below. I'll look forward to connecting with you again soon. Have a great rest of your day.